This is Erik Inglis. I'm an associate professor in the art department at Oberlin College, where I'm a specialist in medieval art. This is a fragment of a larger whole. It's the wing of a triptych. A triptych is a painting divided into 3 panels. Very popular format for altarpieces and private devotional works in 15th century Europe, especially 15th century Flanders, 15th century Northern Europe. And in the case of the wing that we're looking at right now, we've got John the Baptist, who's not the patron of the piece, but is the patron saint for the patron of the piece, standing, dressed in his camel's hair cloak with a gold halo and a red robe. And he's standing behind the patron of the piece, the male patron of the piece, whose name is almost certainly John. We don't know that for sure, but usually your patron saint shares your name. He's your name saint. He's got a book of hours in front of him. He's kneeling on the ground. His hands are clasped in prayer, and he's directing his attention to the right, which is where the central panel would have been. On the opposite side of the triptych would have been almost certainly a portrait of his wife, kneeling before her patron saint, directing her attention also to the central panel. This panel, fragmentary though it is excellent evidence for one of the ways people used portraiture in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages in particular, which is that portraiture was a vehicle to bring yourself into a state of devotion. So if we imagine the original circumstances of the patron looking at this piece, he would be looking at his own portrait, and the portrait of himself that he was looking at was in turn looking to a central scene and praying towards it. And really then the portrait becomes a role model for the person whose portrait it is. They're meant to assume that guise, that posture, that devotion as they contemplate this scene. And the portrait's not the only part of this scene. In this case, the portrait exists in the very foreground, curiously framed by 2 columns on either side. We can imagine that those columns would have been continued up to the top. There's some damage there. And that the other elements of the triptych, the other 2 panels in the triptych, probably had similar columns at the very foreground to give a unified framing. Beyond that, though, there's a road that loops back. It's directly beneath the feet of John the Baptist and the kneeling patron. And then it loops back to the right. And we see there actually several scenes from Christ's life. In the river, if you look directly above John the Baptist, take the John the Baptist in the foreground, and his right hand is raised in gesture. If you follow his fingertip into the water behind him, you'll see another figure in red there, and an almost entirely naked figure standing in the water next to him. The figure in red is John the Baptist, repeated again in the background, and he's shown baptizing Christ there in the River Jordan. And then Christ appears several other times in this piece, because immediately following Christ's baptism in the Jordan, he went into the desert, where he was tempted 3 times by the devil. And we see his temptation by the devil. You see him at the top of the mountaintop on the right. You see him encountering the devil on the road in the middle right. And then at the top of the far distant building in the background in that cityscape, almost certainly meant to represent the temple in Jerusalem, Christ and the devil are shown again. 3 illustrations, or an illustration for each of the 3 temptations that the devil subjects Christ to after his baptism. And it's interesting to speculate whether narratives like this would have been linked to the foreground scene in the main panel of the triptych, or whether they would have been linked potentially to the narrative in the background on the female part of the wing, the right wing of the triptych. Another interesting aspect of this piece is its condition. The figures in the foreground are in very, very good condition. There has been some damage in the background, so that Christ's face and John the Baptist's face at the moment of the baptism have been very badly damaged and inpainted in a fairly non-descriptive way. And by that I mean, rather than trying to reconstruct what their faces would have looked like, the restorer of this piece has chosen instead simply to inpaint a little bit of pink for Christ's face and similar for John the Baptist's face, as a way of allowing the piece to cohere as you look at it from a distance, and at the same time not deceive you when you get up close into thinking you're looking at the actual original painting when you're looking at restoration instead.